It's right here.
I need to hold it the whole time?
We can go get you one. I'll go get you a stand.
Should I wait or just bring it up? Okay. Good morning.
Good morning.
I was told just to get started, so I will. And I'm Seth Dowland. I teach over at Pacific Lutheran and have been there for 12 years. And that away. So I bring greetings from PLU. And I also, from my home congregation, which is Trinity Presbyterian in Tacoma, which is where I normally worship on Sunday mornings. It's good to be with you, and I really appreciate Pastor Kim's invitation to come and talk about Christian nationalism. And I'll say a few words about my approach, just to kind of start. This is my first time with you at Lutheran Church of Christ the King. So I want to say a little about the type of work I do and then what I'll be doing this morning. I'm a historian of American Christianity, and I remain convinced as a historian of American Christianity that we have to know a little about our past to understand how we got here and where we're going. And the past is certainly different. I don't believe history repeats itself, but there are echoes. I think you'll see some of those this morning as I talk about the history of Christian nationalism, and then think about maybe what's going on in our country today, where Christian nationalism has become a major concern of many people, including our Lutheran bishop, and something that we need to pay attention to. So I'm going to race through a lot of history over the next hour and a little more. I do encourage you, if you have questions, just raise your hand. If I trail off or drop the microphone, wave your hand as well. I'm happy to be interrupted and have conversation. But I do want to talk about kind of a broad sweep of history. And then, here's my mic stand. Thank you.
It will go up higher as well.
Does that catch me? I just can't move very much. Put it up a little higher. Yeah.
We short people don't understand.
Okay. And I'll do my best not to roam too far from the microphone. Okay. All right, so when we talk about Christian nationalism, I think it helps to have a definition. So the one I have on a slide, and I'll read all my slides. I know it's probably a little hard to see from the back. But this definition comes from a pair of sociologists who've recently published a book called Taking America Back for God. It's a cultural framework that idealizes and advocates a fusion of Christianity with American civil life or civic life. This is a fairly broad definition. I'm not a huge fan of it because it incorporates a lot of people who we might consider part of the American cultural mainstream, as well as even some important dissenters in American life. So as I'm thinking about Christian nationalism as a historian, I want to acknowledge there are a lot of people in American history who do want Christianity to come to bear on American civic life, to engage Christian values with our politics. One of the most famous examples of this is Martin Luther King Jr., who used biblical concepts of justice to argue for a political revolution in civil rights laws in the 1950s and 60s. And so the type of Christian nationalism that I think concerns people today, concerns other Christians, concerns people in the media, people in politics, is a type of Christian nationalism that views diversity as a threat. And so the type of Christian nationalism I'm going to try to focus on in my lecture today is a Christian nationalism largely driven by white Protestant Christians who, when confronted with increasing diversity in the nation as a whole, whether it's racial diversity or religious diversity, really see that diversity as threatening. And the response often has been a violent response, not just a political response, but a violent response that goes beyond politics, goes beyond the law, to kind of push back or retrench against this increasing diversity. And I'm always kind of amazed, maybe this is the Spirit working or something, but when I go to worship at churches where I'm teaching, how the sermon often kind of leads into the lesson. And so we were hearing, Pastor Pamela this morning was talking about the welcome that Jesus extends and the way Jesus at the well crossed these lines of race, of gender, of ethnicity. And that type of Christianity is often at odds with the type of Christian nationalism that I'm going to be talking about today. So that's a kind of a broad definition and a little overview of terminology that I want to have in mind as I dive into the history. And now we're going to go all the way back to the founding of the United States, because some of what we're dealing with is how Christians have conceptualized this country, and in particular the role of God or providence in the formation of the United States. It's long been the case that American Christians see God's guiding hand in this country's history in particular. So we'll start with a painting. Sorry, the glitchy. I don't know if you can see very well. Up there on the left side of the slide, we have the ascension of George Washington, carried by the angels. This was painted on the occasion of Washington's death. And on the right side of the slide is a national seal that was proposed by Thomas Jefferson. Now, you probably know a little about Thomas Jefferson. He was not an Orthodox Christian. He was lifelong Anglican and donated money to the Anglican Church, but he was very skeptical of some kind of foundational Christian doctrines. He didn't believe in the Trinity. He literally cut apart the New Testament to take out all the miracles of Jesus, to create his own text of the New Testament that contained Jesus' moral teachings, but none of the miraculous stories. There was no resurrection story. There was no walking on water. So Jefferson was not a traditional Christian, but if you can see the seal, it's God parting the Red Sea and then covering the Egyptians miraculously, allowing the Israelites to escape slavery in Egypt. And the words around the edge of the seal says, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God," which is a phrase he borrowed from his friend Ben Franklin. So Jefferson, maybe the most skeptical of the founding fathers, nonetheless thought our national seal should reflect this miraculous story from the Bible that he didn't even believe happened, as a kind of maybe guiding orientation for how we should conceptualize America. That we are the Israelites being led out of slavery in Egypt by the hand of God in a kind of miraculous way, defeating this global superpower, the British Empire, to declare our independence as a nation. Now, of course, there's deep irony in identifying with the Israelites, particularly for somebody like Jefferson, who owned hundreds of slaves himself. White Americans have always, I think, wanted to identify more with the Israelites than the Egyptians, whereas black Christians have very often said, no, we are the ones that are enslaved in a foreign land, and we are in Egypt right now. And so there's this, I think, contest over where America fits in the biblical story that's there from the very beginning. And it's long been the case that white Americans have seen themselves as a kind of chosen people. The most skeptical of our kind of 18th and 19th century presidents might have been Abraham Lincoln. He called us the almost chosen people, which I kind of love. But it is this notion that some way, somehow, God had a role to play, even in the formation of the United States. And that has spilled over into kind of how we think about the country and how we recognize the relationship between church and state. That's always been a very muddy question. And I want to talk briefly about the creation of the First Amendment, which is the constitutional framework for religious freedom. Pictured on the slide here is James Madison, who was the architect of the Constitution, who wrote the Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment. And when he drafted the First Amendment, he had this really robust guarantee of church-state separation in his initial draft. So Madison's original read as follows: "The civil rights of none shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship, nor shall any national religion be established, nor shall the full and equal rights of conscience be in any manner or on any pretext infringed." I'm sorry about the shaking of the slide, but I will do my best to kind of convey what's on the slide. So Madison has this real detailed acknowledgement that we're not going to have a national church like the Church of England, and people can believe whatever they want. Everybody has full and equal rights of conscience. This version of religious freedom was far too radical for most of Madison's contemporaries in the First Congress. These were all elite white men who were kind of moving into this new democratic order, a new form of government. And most of them believed the church had a role to play in maintaining order. Basically, what's to keep the masses from rising up and overthrowing us? We just threw off Britain. And they saw the church as having a role to play in maintaining order, into cultivating kind of civic virtue, maybe some boundary drawing. And so what happened to Madison's original draft was it got watered down, right? Now, y'all are Lutherans, I'm a Presbyterian, we all love committees. This goes to a committee, and the First Amendment, the committee kind of charged with revising the Bill of Rights, it starts to water down Madison's version. One proposal was Congress shall make no laws touching religion or infringing the rights of conscience. Another version says Congress shall make no law establishing one religious sect or society in preference to others. And we ended up with the final version, the version that is in the First Amendment today, which reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It is much more vague than Madison's original draft. We don't get any instructions in the First Amendment about what constitutes an establishment of religion. Basically, the thing that everybody knows that Congress can't do is establish a single national church. We can't have a Church of America. But beyond that, it doesn't say anything about state establishments, and many states had official kind of tax-supported churches well into the 19th century. It doesn't say you can't give tax breaks to churches, which of course is something that came about when taxation became more widespread in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. we have lots of entanglements of the federal government and Christianity. And of course, many founders wanted that to be the case. Madison wanted to keep them very far apart, but lots of other people in the first Congress wanted church and state to be kind of tied up with one another. And then the second part of the First Amendment says we can't prohibit the free exercise of religion. Basically, people should be able to practice their faith in whatever the way they see fit. But that's run into problems too. So in the 19th century, as Roman Catholics began to immigrate to the United States in large numbers, there were bitter fights between Protestants and Catholics about which version of the Bible their kids would read in public schools. Most of you probably know Protestants and Catholics have different Bibles. The Protestant Bible in the 19th century was the King James Version. It was unfootnoted. It was just the text. It was taught by Protestant school teachers who would talk about the Catholic Church as the whore of Babylon, or the demonic institution. And Catholic parents said, hold on a minute. This school's got 90% Catholic students, so we don't want to take the Bible out of schools, we just want the Catholic Bible. And the Protestants said, no, you can't do that. The Catholic Bible has footnotes, so it's sectarian. And it was like, well, how is that not our free exercise right? And this is the genesis of the parochial school system. This is why Catholics created their own schools. So we're going to educate our kids so they don't go to school and have their faith attacked. Mormons, another prominent case of free exercise in the 19th century. Mormons taught in the 19th century that it was a blessing from God to have multiple wives. They practiced polygamy. White Protestants were horrified. And this caused the Congress to pass a law in 1862, the Morrill Act, that said bigamy is illegal in the United States. It was specifically targeted at a religious practice, Mormon plural marriage. Mormons challenged this in court. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. In 1878, the Supreme Court upheld the anti-bigamy law on the basis that polygamy, according to the U.S. Supreme Court, has always been the practice of what they call the barbarous nations of Asia and Africa. And in our white Protestant nation, we will not allow this to stand. And it was a case where we see the limits of the First Amendment, the free exercise clause, because it signaled like, well, free exercise for me, but not for thee, right? It's this kind of, Protestants have always enjoyed more free exercise than non-Protestant Christians or non-Christians generally. And so this muddiness of the First Amendment, this sense that America is a nation chosen by God, has contributed to this lack of clarity about how much influence Christianity ought to have and does have in the governing of the United States. There's probably differences of opinions in this room about how much influence Christianity ought to and does have in the governing of the nation, and it's a problem we've been dealing with for 250 years. It was there from the very beginning. What should the relationship with church and state be? So that's the framework we're working within. This muddy constitutional language, this lack of clarity, and this sense that we are chosen by God. And that sense of chosenness got challenged in a really dramatic way by the United States Civil War. So the Civil War happens at a moment where evangelical Protestantism is dominant in the country. And I have here just a few words about evangelical Christianity that refer to the widespread kind of occasion of revivals. So revivals were these supposedly spontaneous, they became less spontaneous as the years went on. Meetings where preachers would preach outdoors to sometimes thousands of people. Some of these were called camp meetings. People would camp out for a week. And these revivals were, there's a famous revivalist pictured on the slide, Lorenzo Dow. He was this Methodist minister who traveled all around preaching at revivals, convincing people of their sinfulness and their need for a Savior. And revivals, in some ways, democratized American Christianity. It took church kind of outside the walls of a building. It diminished the importance of education, of credentials, and it made kind of a more egalitarian Christianity. And there were people of color who preached at revivals. There were women who preached at revivals. And what was kind of privileged above all else in evangelical Christianity was an instantaneous conversion experience where you felt the presence of God coming into your body. And sometimes this manifested in very physical ways, people kind of falling on the floor, rolling on the ground. You felt the ability of people to claim authority based on their popular appeal. Right? The ministers who succeeded in a revival context were not the ones with the most degrees. They were not the ones who were sanctioned by the bishops. They were the ones who people came to hear. So charisma, like power, humor, those were really important. And you also had this sense that everybody should be hearing from God directly. So this is direct revelation, this notion that God speaks to everybody in a direct way. And that does create a kind of a more egalitarian framework for Christian faith. But it also means what you hear from God is probably different from what I hear from God. Right? We all hear different things from God. And who's to judge which of that is from God and which of that is from ourselves? This is kind of the nature of evangelical faith. I think it's probably there from the Protestant Reformation, when Luther translated the Bible into German, and the implication was everybody should be able to read the Bible for themselves. Now, Luther wanted people to do that in community, do that with the church. But there's always been this impulse in Protestantism that we don't have to rely on the priest to get the message from God. We should be able to hear from God ourselves. And what we see at the Civil War is this break in the church. Historian Mark Knoll has called the Civil War a theological crisis. Because in the run-up to the Civil War, the three biggest denominations in the country, the Methodists, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, they all split into northern and southern branches. The Presbyterians split in 1842, the Methodists split in 1844, the Baptists split in 1845. So it happened really rapidly in the early 1840s. The Southern Baptist Convention, which formed in 1845, said explicitly in its charter, we don't differ from our northern brethren on any issue of theology. The only thing we differ with Northern Baptists on is the issue of slavery. Specifically, whether slaveholders could serve as Baptist missionaries. And the Northern Baptists said, we cannot be sending slaveholders on missions. And the Southern Baptists said, that is an affront, because God has sanctioned the institution of slavery. You see it in the Bible. And so there's this divide in the church, and there's no real way to kind of mediate who is correct. Right? This is, I think, one of the problems that Protestants have always been living with, and that's why we have so many denominations, right? Is we have a constant division over who's correct. And so you get this kind of divide in the church. Some of these divisions have never been reconciled. The Southern Baptist Convention still exists and is not reunified with the American Baptists. The Presbyterians and Methodists did come back together, but it took 100 years. The Methodists reunified in 1939, the Presbyterians not until 1982. So these divisions were long-standing, and they represented a kind of cleavage in the church, and a cleavage in the nation, obviously. So what we see in the Civil War is American Protestantism being unable to speak with a clear moral voice on the issue of slavery. Right? What you believed about slavery depended largely, obviously, on your race, but also on what region of the country you lived in. White Southerners thought quite strongly that the institution of slavery was sanctioned by God and the Bible. There were thousands of pro-slavery sermons preached in the run-up to and during the war. And the same way in the North, lots of white Christians had come to believe that the institution of slavery was a scourge. And they didn't do this out of, I think, racial progressivism. Most white Northerners saw black people as an inferior race. But they did kind of, because of their different economy, have reasons to kind of disparage Southerners as reliant on slavery, whereas we enlightened Northerners were, moving forward with this industrial progress. And so they argued against slavery, not out of any sense that black people were equal to white people. Some did, but not many. But out of this sense that this was a kind of regional advantage, and we can marshal the Bible to support our point of view. And this creates these rifts in American Christianity. You have three broad streams coming out of the Civil War. You have white Protestants in the North, white Protestants in the South, and black Protestants, who, at the end of the Civil War, virtually all black Protestants left white Protestant churches in the 15 years after the Civil War. If you look at African American denominations, historically black colleges and universities, an overwhelming majority of them were formed between 1865 and 1890, at this moment where, although they could exercise very little economic or political power, African Americans could kind of speak with their feet in the matter of religion and form their own churches and denominations. And we see this today, right? The church is still largely segregated by race. And it does challenge the notion that this is a nation chosen by, blessed by God. If God had chosen us, how could the Civil War happen? How could we be, so far apart? If we were a Christian nation, how could we not agree on the issue of slavery? And this is the moment, prior to the 21st century, the decade of the 1860s, this is like the decade of the Civil War, is the only decade in the 19th and 20th century where we see church membership or church attendance decline. People are kind of left with these questions. There's this sense of darkness and kind of wondering, where is God in this conflict? This was a central concern of President Lincoln's. And in the aftermath of the war, this is one of the I think it's one of the darkest chapters of American history. What we see in the aftermath of the war in the late 19th century is a national reunion of white people that is predicated on the oppression of people of color. And I want to kind of borrow the work of a historian named Ed Bloom, who's written this book called Reforging the White Republic, where he talks about how white Protestants in the North and white Protestants in the South came together in the years after the Civil War, after this rupture, to kind of come back together, but to do so without incorporating or including African Americans in this new version of Christianity. And so Some of you may know the name Dwight Moody. He's the most famous evangelist of the late 19th century. He was a shoe salesman in Chicago. Thought he could sell Christianity better than he could sell shoes. So he becomes this revival preacher. And Moody was an anti-slavery. He was an abolitionist. He argued against slavery. He thought this was a scourge. It was anti-Christian to own slaves. And he began to incorporate, in a small way, African Americans into his ministry in Chicago. But Moody had grand sort of national ambitions. And those included the South, where at the same time that his revival empire was spreading, the states of the U.S. South were passing scores of Jim Crow laws mandating racial segregation in all sorts of spaces, including religious spaces. And so Moody, who had desegregated some of his revivals in the North, began to accept racial segregation as the price of doing business in the South. I will racially segregate. But then he brought it back with him to the North. And we can see this just in his Bible Institute. It took his name after his death, Moody Bible Institute. Moody Bible Institute had an interracial student body. But at the beginning of the 20th century, they reversed their policy of allowing black students to live on campus and said it would be embarrassing for black students to live with white students. And told black students, if you want to come to school here, you're going to have to find another place to live. You cannot live on campus with white students. And so you see Moody's kind of evangelistic empire spreading, and the cost is any sense of kind of racial justice. Basically, we are not going to pursue integration because that's going to be a problem for our white Southern colleagues, and so we're not going to do that, right? We see some of the same happening in the yellow fever epidemic of 1870s. Sorry, my remote's a little finicky. And in the temperance campaign, which is the campaign to outlaw alcohol. If you can't see the image on the bottom, it's an image of all the counties in the United States that have outlawed alcohol depicted in white. And the message of the temperance crusaders was make the map all white, which is not particularly subtle, I don't think. The leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union was a Methodist from Ohio named Frances Willard. And she used to talk about kind of the dark-faced whiskey supporters. And she connoted this image of the drunken black man who would attack white women as an argument for outlawing alcohol. This is a scourge that we need to be concerned with. And there's a famous anti-lynching journalist, Ida B. Wells Barnett, a black woman from Memphis, who wrote Frances Willard and said, "You need to stop doing this. These stereotypes of black men is what authorizes thousands of lynchings in the South." And Willard, this white woman from Ohio, said, "I don't know what you're talking about. Alcohol's the problem. And if black people get drunk, then we need to take the alcohol away from them." And you see in the temperance this sort of racialized rhetoric becoming normal, and just this kind of institutionalization of white supremacy, which is codified in law through Jim Crow laws. Right? So after the elimination of slavery in the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, there was this moment during Reconstruction where black people enjoyed unprecedented political rights and civic equality, but that gets rolled back after 1875 through the passage of hundreds, if not thousands, of Jim Crow laws throughout the South. Those Jim Crow laws are upheld in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, the Supreme Court decision that said separate but equal is constitutional under the law. And so you see white Christians coming together across this regional divide that had threatened to destroy the nation in the Civil War, that actually did caused the secession of 11 southern states. But by the turn of the 20th century, the nation was celebrating its sort of reunion. It's coming back together. But it did so, I think, with... a vision of Christian nationalism that is combined with white racial identity as what it means to be a true American. And this kind of Christian nationalism, I think, it's threatened. I mean, this was my argument on the first slide, right? It was threatened by the Reconstruction period, where African Americans in the South, recently freed slaves, were given newfound political rights. And white Southerners said, we cannot abide that. And white Northerners, some of whom did fight the Civil War, I think certainly to free the slaves, but maybe even to suggest it would be the duty of a Christian nation to give all people equal access to the law, equal access to the political institutions. That promise gets taken away during the period after Reconstruction, which was called redemption. This period from about 1875 to 1900. Redemption is a religious word. And what white Southerners were redeeming was their region from the scourge of interracial government. I didn't talk about it, it was the last bullet on my last slide, but there's this infamous coup d'etat in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, where an interracial government had recently been elected, duly elected, democratically elected. And white politicians and business owners violently attacked the black neighborhoods of Wilmington and deposed the recently elected interracial city government to install an all-white government.
And there's a recent book about that whole story, and the images of whites taking back the government by parading Gatling guns through the street, intimidating blacks.
Yeah. And it's that feeling of being under threat. And white Americans weren't under threat. Well, the threat, I guess, was they would lose the privilege they had always enjoyed under slavery. And it is often done under the banner of Christianity, right? This is a good Christian nation, and we want good, respectable, white Christian people in office. We will get anarchy and chaos if we allow this diversity to proliferate in our city government. So it's a really dark chapter in American history, this late 19th, early 20th century period. You have the situation where, and this is actually different than even under slavery, where black Christians often, during the era of slavery, were worshiping alongside white Christians and challenging them on questions of biblical interpretation. Now those black Christians aren't in the churches where white Christians are worshiping. And that makes it easier for racism to go unchallenged. And so you have a situation that this exodus of black Christians after the Civil War has created a scenario where white Christians are kind of feeding on this impulse of white supremacy. And it really, I think, manifests in a most spectacular, so that got a good connotation, I don't want to suggest that, in a notable way with the dramatic growth of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. The picture here on the bottom right is from the Seattle Armory in 1923.
Seattle?
Yes. Oregon had one of the strongest Klan chapters in the country, as did Indiana. The Klan of the 1920s was stronger north of the Mason-Dixon line than it was south of the Mason-Dixon. And this was a Klan that, so the original KKK was formed in 1867, right after the Civil War, by former Confederates who wanted to fight against Reconstruction. It had mostly disbanded by the 1880s. Federal legislation was passed against the Klan, and frankly, the rise of Jim Crow kind of had done the work of the Klan for it. So by the 1900, there wasn't much of a viable Klan in the United States. But the Klan was sort of rebirthed symbolically on Thanksgiving Day in 1915, atop Stone Mountain outside Atlanta. I don't know if any of you have been to or seen pictures of Stone Mountain. It's this massive hunk of granite outside the city of Atlanta. I grew up in Atlanta, and we used to go with the youth group because there was a laser show on the face of Stone Mountain every night during the summer. So they'd have a laser show with music and fireworks. And it was just part of the cultural water I swam in as a white kid growing up outside Atlanta. There are 3 Confederate generals carved into the face of Stone Mountain, kind of like Mount Rushmore. So there's Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson carved into the face of Stone Mountain. And I don't think it occurred to me as a high school kid how odd that was to have Confederate generals carved into the face of Stone Mountain. They weren't there when the Klan was rebirthed in 1915, but it was this symbolic kind of place for the Klan to sort of have this rebirth. And then in the 1920s, it grew dramatically. By 1925, some historians estimate there were 5 million members of the Ku Klux Klan across the country. The nation's population, just for reference, at this time was around 100 million. So 5% of Americans belonged to the Klan. Many more than that were affiliated. There were women's auxiliaries. The Klan was notorious for very publicly presenting offerings to Protestant churches. They would parade down at the top during the offertory and hand the money to the minister. So even if you were a skeptical minister, you're faced with a difficult choice there. Do you accept the Klan's money? Because that's probably the easy thing to do. Or do you reject it and subject yourself to kind of the enmity of the KKK? And so the Klan actually recruited Protestant ministers by offering free membership to 40,000 of them. And it sponsored little leagues and parades. Early air shows were Klan sponsored. They were this kind of image of a wholesome family environment, the Klan. But they were very explicit. You can go and read Hiram Evans, who was the imperial wizard of the KKK. He wrote an essay in the North American Review, this major literary magazine, in 1926, where he said, what it means to be a true American is to be white and to be Protestant. Those things are integral to our national identity. Protestantism teaches us democratic values, and whiteness has been revealed through science. This is the era of scientific racism, to be the superior race. And so for our nation to remain great, for our nation to retain its moral character, we need to make sure it's always a white Protestant nation. And so the Klan opposed, obviously, African Americans, but it also, the 1920s Klan, directed a lot of its aggression towards Catholics and Jews. Catholics in particular had immigrated in huge numbers to the United States in the late 19th century, and the Klan saw this as a threat. They actually had I told Connie my remote doesn't always work. I know you can't read this. It's a creed, written in the style of the Nicene Creed or the Apostles' Creed, that the Klan asked people to recite when they joined the order. And I'll read a few of the bullet points. It says, I believe in God and the tenets of the Christian religion, and that a godless nation cannot long prosper. And then 4 lines down, very interestingly, I believe in the eternal separation of church and state. Curious. Getting at that muddy relationship between church and state that I talked about a few minutes ago. And I think what I see kind of encoded in this language is we Protestants, we've always separated church and state. It's the Catholics who want to combine them. And if we let too many Catholics into this country, their allegiance is to the Pope over the Constitution. We need to keep the Catholics out. And that's underlined, I believe, I'm a native-born American citizen, and I believe my rights in this country are greater than that of foreigners. So the agenda of the 20s Klan was, yes, anti-black, but it was anti-Catholic, it was anti-immigrant. And we see up here, it was not the shadowy Klan of the 19th century. They are marching down the streets of Washington, D.C., unmasked, with the U.S. Capitol in the background. And every time I show this image to my students, well, first of all, they have the same reaction some of you had when you said Seattle. But also, they see the U.S. Capitol, and you can't help but think about January 6th and the insurrection. There was an assertion by the Klan in the 1920s that this is a nation that has existed for so long as the province of white Protestant Americans, and that identity is under threat at this moment with Catholic immigration, with the rise in the kind of political rights of African Americans. And we need to work against that. We need to fight back against the increasing diversity of this country. And it was an appealing message, so much so that this organization kind of mushroomed in growth to 5 million people, and really was a kind of a mainstay for a lot of white Protestants across the country. It was just part of the background of civic life. It's a little hard to imagine because the Klan is such a sort of a fringe group, but it's a reminder of how these things can happen. I want to see where we're at. I'm going to take a step to kind of see if there are questions or comments, or I want to get us into the present in the last half hour here, but I did want to kind of offer the chance. Are there any questions or reflections that anybody has? Yeah.
So what you're presenting to us is really kind of a true sense of American history around all these issues. We have a political party that's pushing back against the truthfulness of what you're teaching us, right? You wouldn't label this critical race theory, but at the same time, you are giving us a sense of that we face even now. Right?
Yeah. There is. It's much smaller. The Klan surged again during the Civil Rights Movement of the 50s and 60s. There are still kind of scattered Klan chapters, but it's pretty marginal at this point in American history. I would argue there are other groups that have kind of taken up some of the mantle of the Klan, but...
Do you see any parallels between QAnon and Klan?
QAnon, the conspiracy theory QAnon. I think there is this sense that both groups kind of feed upon people's fears of increasing diversity, of the decline of Christianity, or of white Christian dominance in the country. And so I think both groups are able to capitalize on that. They do work, obviously, in different ways, because we're living in a different kind of technological world today. But yes.
Comment. I remember when JFK was elected, and the concern was, would he be more loyal to the Pope, than to the Constitution?
1960 election, JFK went down to Texas, spoke at the Baptist Ministerial Alliance, and he said to them, this is fascinating, I think, my religion will have no bearing on the policy I do as president. And he said that because he knew everybody's concerned that he's going to be loyal to the Pope. But that's not something we ask Protestant politicians to affirm. In fact, it would work against, particularly Republican candidates, to say my faith will have no bearing on my policy making. And so you kind of see the ways in which religious freedom is extended selectively, and white Protestants have long maintained kind of a position of privilege in American history. Now, I want to start moving us rapidly toward the present. I've been dwelling in somewhat of a distant past. I want to talk briefly about the 50s and 60s because I think they set the stage for where we are today. The 1950s was an era where it seemed like there was a growing national consensus, right? This is the era of Leave It to Beaver, of Dwight Eisenhower, of this kind of sense of we're all pulling in the same direction against the Soviets in the Cold War. This was the decade that saw the emergence of Billy Graham as a kind of national evangelist. His big breakout was in 1949. Eisenhower, as president, really wanted to emphasize that we are a Christian nation. So it was under his presidency that we had the first national prayer breakfast, which has come to become this massive event every February that gathers politicians and judges and business leaders around a kind of shared sense that we are a Christian nation and we need to have Christianity in our political life. Ike called on Congress to affirm our religious character as a nation, and that Congress responded. They added "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954. They added "In God We Trust" to all U.S. currency in 1956. And this is a moment where church membership was surging. Protestant churches, Catholic churches too, they were all bursting at the seams by the end of the 1950s. Church membership reaches high watermark in 1960 at about 69% of the American population. Are we seeing that on the timeline over here, Connie?
Oh yeah, 1969, 927 members.
Here we are as an object lesson. This is the moment where churches were growing. And I think importantly, the 1950s were an era of just historically low levels of immigration. Congress had passed a quota system for immigration in 1924, partly at the urging of the Klan. Last slide. And the foreign-born population, which was about 13% of Americans in 1930, dropped to 5% by 1970. So you had this situation where, particularly if you were white, you could imagine a sort of national consensus building in the 1950s. That this is a nation that is poised as kind of the greatest superpower in the world. It is the bulwark against communism, which is spreading throughout Eastern Europe. And it is a land of abundance. You think back to the 1950s, where you know, part of the argument for American democracy over Soviet communism were these images of, you know, kitchens stocked full of food with new technology, microwaves and refrigerators. And they didn't, you know, planned economies couldn't match what we had here in the United States. And there was also the sense that we had that because we were a nation that was faithful to God. God had chosen us. So we have that old idea of American chosenness surging in the 1950s. But then we have the 1960s. And the 1960s obliterated the notion of a national consensus. The Civil Rights Movement obviously challenged white Americans' separate but equal environmental laws that had been in place since the late 19th century. You have the emergence of second-wave feminism. You have the gay rights movement. You have the anti-war movement. And in 1965, Congress repealed the quota system that had been in place since 1924. And this opens the door to immigrants from all over the world. Most notably, Latin America began to send millions of immigrants to the United States, beginning in earnest in the 1960s. And again, challenged by diversity of viewpoint, diversity of race, diversity of religion, there is this move to retrench, to fight back, to challenge. And it's in the 1970s that we get the emergence of a movement that I think is still with us called the religious right. And now I'm going to show an image that is this terrible image to put on a slide, but I put it there because it's one of my favorites. I found this myself in an archive when I was researching my doctoral dissertation at Liberty University in Virginia. It's an ad for a K-12 private Christian academy, Lynchburg Christian Academy, established in Lynchburg, Virginia by the Reverend Jerry Falwell. Some of you probably remember Jerry Falwell from the Moral Majority. Falwell was an independent Baptist minister who had one of the 10 largest churches in the country and also established a K-12 academy. Not coincidentally, it was the same year that Lynchburg schools desegregated in 1967 that they started the private Christian school. And this is an ad from 1975. Now, the school had integrated by this point, Lynchburg Christian Academy. But it was still bursting at the seams with mostly white parents wanting to send their kids to school at Lynchburg Christian Academy. And the flyer is called 5 Things We Think You Will Like About Lynchburg Christian Academy. The first one is quality education. That's not a controversial one. But then it says no drug problem. Bible reading and prayer are legal at Lynchburg Christian Academy. The Supreme Court had just a decade earlier said devotional Bible reading and mandatory prayer are unconstitutional in public schools. And so they're kind of marketing to Christians who are upset about this decision to take prayer out of schools. My favorite is on the top right. I don't know if you can see. It's got a group of protesters with the big red no over it. It says, "We have no hippies at Lynchburg Christian Academy." And then the bottom one is, our students are taught to love America. And there is, I think, a not very subtle implication that there are a lot of people in this country who don't love America. These are the people who are protesting the war. These are the people who are challenging gender roles. On the facing page of this flyer, it says, "You can tell our boys from our girls without a medical examination." And there's this implication that feminism and gay rights are upending these God-given gender roles that we know the society needs for things to operate smoothly. And so Lynchburg Christian Academy is one of thousands of Christian schools that are established during this time period. And they are established, many of them at first, to combat desegregation. But then as time goes on, they kind of shift their message. I think it's still the case that whiteness is important, but they shift their message to say, we are the true patriotic Americans, and we know we are this way because we're good and decent, God-fearing people, where men and women know their place, where we teach the respect for authority, and we kind of disdain these protest movements that have roiled the country in the 1960s. And I think you can see just in this flyer some of the arguments that really led to the coalescence of the religious right in the 1970s. First, the revolutions of the 1960s, for many white conservatives, they were not progress. They represented an attack on American values. And so there's this sense that we need to go back to an earlier generation. There's another part of this flyer that says, kids today aren't worse than they were 25 years ago. They just come from worse homes and schools. our society is going to hell in a handbasket. We have to do something about it. And in particular, there's an argument that political and social liberals have failed to promote morality, have failed to promote order. And so we need to fight back against that. And we also have, this is a kind of inside baseball political thing, but when President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Lyndon Johnson was a Democrat from Texas. He turned to his aide, Bill Moyers, who went on to a long career in public television, and he said, we just lost the South for a generation. Basically, the Democrats, which had long been the party of the white South, knew that white Southerners were going to abandon the Democratic Party. And that's what happened. White Southerners left the Democratic Party and over the next generation moved into the Republican Party. And that created the possibility for a national political coalition because white evangelicals in the North and West had long been in the Republican Party. And now they have white Southerners in the Republican Party as well. And it was Richard Nixon was the first Republican presidential candidate to say, there's an opportunity for us here to peel the South away from the Democratic Party and to make the South part of the Republican coalition if we can kind of speak to their concerns, many of which were racial in origin. And that's exactly what happened. And so you see this regional political realignment in the 1970s that still guides our politics today if you look at electoral maps after each presidential election. And it's the argument for most of the 20th century that the religious right represents a majority of the population. Think about Jerry Falwell's political action group. It was called Moral Majority. And the moral majority argued that a minority, an immoral minority perhaps, of liberals had hijacked the nation. And we need to take it back. And we do that by electing conservative candidates to office. And you can see this just in the kind of exit polling of presidential elections. You don't need to read all the stats, but it shows basically that in 1976, white evangelicals voted for Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford at a proportional rate to the rest of the population. Basically, the white evangelicals were split Republican and Democrat fairly evenly, just like the rest of the population. But beginning with the 1980 election, that changes. And white evangelicals vote for Reagan at a higher rate than the rest of the population by 9%. And by the time we get to the 2016 election, white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump at a rate 33 points higher than the rest of the population. So there's something about evangelical identity that over the last 50 years has come to connote Republican political identity. Basically, this is the party that is fighting for our values. And it didn't, frankly, matter all that much that the last two Republican nominees, Mitt Romney, Donald Trump, and I'd even go back to John McCain in 2008, were not evangelicals. McCain was an Episcopalian, Mitt Romney's a Mormon, Donald Trump was a Presbyterian, ostensibly. Nobody would confuse him with somebody who's spent a lot of his life in church. But his message was quite clear to white evangelicals. I am going to fight for the country we once had. I'm going to fight for a Christian nation. There's a very influential book that one of my colleagues, Kristen Covas-Dumais, who teaches at Calvin College, has written called Jesus and John Wayne. It's a great history of the last 70 years. And her argument in the introduction is, white evangelicals didn't vote for Donald Trump in spite of their beliefs. They voted for Donald Trump because of their beliefs. Basically, that Trump, for them, represented a fighter who would challenge liberals who wanted to diversify the country, who wanted to kind of lessen the influence of Christianity, who wanted to embrace new gender and sexual identities into the mainstream. And that was appealing to a whole bunch of white Christians and remains appealing to this day. And it's compounded by the fact that white Christianity is declining in this country. So some statistics about the decline. Right now, latest data I could find before today, about 63% of Americans identify as Christian. It's down from a high of close to 80% 20 years ago. That's a rapid decline in a short amount of time. And I put in parentheses the stats for Seattle. It's only about 52% in the Seattle metro area who identify as Christian. The share of white Christians fell under 50% for the first time just 10 years ago. So white Christians had always been a majority in American history until 2012. They're not a majority anymore. And most people, this isn't because other religious faiths have surged. The biggest non-Christian population in the country is Jewish, which is only about 2% of the American population. Muslims make up about 1% of the American population. By far, the biggest group of non-Christians are the unaffiliated. Or they're sometimes called the nones, N-O-N-E-S, because they, when asked their religious preference, say none of the above. And the nones represent 23% in the nation and 37% in our area. And so here we are, I think, circling back to where I started, which is increasing diversity, challenges to white Protestant authority. They are felt especially acutely, maybe even by some of you, in this current moment. Because the nation as a whole is shifting. And we can see this even in attitudes on social issues, particularly on issues around gender and sexuality. In 2004, referenda against gay marriage passed on every state ballot that they were presented. In 2008, so we're just talking 15, passed Prop 8 so questions of sexuality, attitudes on these issues have changed dramatically just in the last 15 years. Right? The Supreme Court guaranteed the rights of same-sex people to marry in 2015 with Obergefell v. Hodges. The Supreme Court, just 3 years ago, in the Bostock decision, guaranteed the rights of transgender employees under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And popular approval of gay marriage has basically doubled just in the last 2 decades, from around 37% in 2005 to 70% 2 years ago. We don't have as good as stats for transgender rights, but because pollsters didn't ask about it until very recently. But in 2021, about half of Americans said it was morally acceptable to change one's gender identity. For some people, these are incredible signs of progress. And for other people, they are signs of a world gone amok, a culture that has lost its way. And so I think what we're seeing with Christian nationalism surging in this moment is a reaction of a group of Americans who are saying, this is not the country we've always known, this is not the country we ought to be. And historically, the first part of that claim has some truth to it. The culture is changing. And if you're somebody who celebrates these changes, I think it is important to acknowledge they are nonetheless dramatic shifts in the way things have always been. Maybe long overdue, crucial for people's well-being and inclusion and the kind of type of Christian hospitality we want to extend. But they are dramatic changes in the way things are. And I think at some level, change is always unsettling to an extent, right? Where we run into trouble is people who want to push back on that change violently. This image is from January 6th. One of the underreported phenomena of January 6th was the incredible amount of religious symbolism that was there at the Capitol that day. There's a great website put together by a colleague of mine at the University of Alabama, along with a curator at the Smithsonian Museum of American History, called Uncivil Religion. It's uncivilreligion.org. And it documents all the ways religion was present at the Capitol that day. People praying before they stormed the Capitol, people singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic as they marched through the rotunda of the Capitol, the cross erected outside, and the way this was kind of connected for many of the insurrectionists with their Christian faith. This is what God is calling me to do. And I hear echoes of the 1920s Klan, that this is part of who I am as a Christian. And I think the challenge that we face in America is that we've never had consensus on what Christianity's relationship is to the state. I think, there's this assumption on the left that, well, the founders wanted church and state to be wholly separate. And there's assumption on the right that, well, we established the nation as a Christian nation. And both sides can claim selectively history that kind of supports their side, but we've never had a kind of consensus about how Christianity should be related to the state. And what we see is these moments of change, of turmoil, of diversity, is a reassertion that no, it's our nation. It's the nation of white Christians, and we need to defend that. Really, beyond legal means, right? We need to overturn an election. And we do so under the banner of Christianity with the authority of God. And so here's where we get to the end, and I don't have any answers. I'm going to make the terrible historian jokes. Like, I'm terrible at, historians can tell you all about the past, but nothing about the future. I don't think that's entirely true, but I do have to lean on my colleagues in Christian ethics who, have suggested, I think, some helpful strategies for us when we kind of confront Christian nationalism. One of these is a kind of triage strategy, which is you have to kind of, I think all of us probably have friends and neighbors and family members who we find these things hard to talk about with. And one of the triage strategy is you have to decide kind of right time, right place, how likely is any intervention in this relationship to be effective. I think another strategy is acknowledging very frankly, like, this change is unsettling to me too at some level, right? And I'm grappling with, certain amounts of this change, and maybe here's why I think it's a good thing. But I don't have any kind of tried and true solutions. I think it's a really difficult moment that we're in. I'm going to kind of skip through to my last slide, which is two images taken from the last few years, one from January 6th and one from a Black Lives Matter rally in 2020. Christians convince in certain ways, but doing so to very different ends, right? And we're back to that problem that presented itself most dramatically at the time of the Civil War. What is God's religious affirmation? we can do is probably to involve ourselves in relationships with people who look different than us, who think differently than us, to kind of test out, is this making sense to you? Because it makes a lot of sense to me, but if others, that don't look like me or don't think like me say, hold on a minute, that's not really what the Bible says. That could be a way of starting to wade through these murky waters. But also then to kind of keep the principle of justice in front of us, which I think is what Pastor Pamela was calling us to this morning. That the Jesus we worship is one that welcomed all people. And to the extent we're pursuing policies that alienate and exclude and oppress, then we need to be mindful of that and to reject those forms of injustice as well. So that was a race through a lot of history. I'm imagining some wheels are turning, at least I hope so, maybe some questions, but I did want to end before, a whole 3 minutes before my allotted time, and offer the chance for any questions, comments, thoughts. Yeah.
Well, I'm here because of Margaret and Connie, but we are fighting a huge, real fight, and we've got white nationalist churches in our communities that are 100% backing the overthrow of all of our school districts, and it's real. And some people in the audiences have already experienced it. And it's a threat to not only our schools, but to democracy itself, because this is a cult. And it's reached a point where you can't sit down and talk to them.
Yeah.
And I brought an example to give to you.
Okay.
Of what we're facing, and it's scary. If everybody would start paying attention, what I was thrilled about is that when Margaret Connie told me that the Lutheran leadership was actually starting to speak out and recognize that other people in our community, people of color, this is something that is a very, very real threat. And the national organizations have come into our community now, all through Pierce County. So they've set up chapters in our county, and their goal is to take over every school district and every city council government in Pierce County. They're here now, and they're at our school board meetings now, and they're organized, and they come from all over. They don't care that they live in your school district. They're coming over and attacking now.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate the history that gives me why. I'm just confused why.
Yeah.
But this thing,
Yeah. Well, thanks for being here, and thanks for fighting the good fight. Yeah.
I encourage everybody to start paying attention.
Yeah.
This is a little bit of an aside, but not very far aside. In 2002, a study was done looking at fascism under Hitler, Mussolini, all strong-arm kind of leaders. They came up with 14 clues that this person, this group, is leaning towards fascism. And it just sort of reads. It just sort of reads like the agenda of the far right, under strong leadership, oppression of a particular group, scapegoating,
Yeah.
pushing back against free press, all of that. And it seems to me that it's that Christian nationalism, besides not being Christian or democratic, is really pulling our nation towards that same kind of leadership.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, it's interesting, you said CRT earlier, and we talked about schools. I think, maybe I flatter myself, but I really do think just telling this history helps people kind of, oh, wow, like this is a pernicious force, and when you're confronted with it, it's like, well, yeah, clearly the KKK was wrong. But if we're doing some of the same things that they were, maybe we should, reconsider. And I do think part of what's hard about it is because so many people see America as a kind of chosen nation, it's really uncomfortable to deal with these dark chapters. And yet, we have to, right? I think it's instructive for how quickly we can fall into these traps of kind of oppressing people so that we maintain our privilege. And so I'm grateful for the chance to talk to you about it, and I encourage you to talk to others.
I'm curious about how your students take this message, how they respond, how they hear it, maybe what kind of questions they ask about it.
So PLU's a different place today than it was just 10 years ago when I started, in that the student body is now, incoming class is now majority students of color. The Lutheran share of the PLU student body is below 10%. So many of my students are deeply suspicious of Christianity in a way that I didn't experience even 10 years ago. And so I have probably a majority of students who, when I talk about many of the bad things that have been done in the name of Christianity, they're kind of like, right on, preach, like, yeah. And I've actually found myself as a Christian kind of saying, well, hold on a minute, it's a little more complicated. I actually just developed a first-year class on Christianity and social justice, where we read King and Cesar Chavez and other Christians who kind of fought for civil rights. So the majority response is, yes, we know Christianity has done all these evil things. The minority of students who, we have a minority of conservative students, I think they're trying to kind of figure it out. Like, they're for the most part kind of accepting of these changes we talked about in terms of accepting feminism and gay rights and transgender rights, but they still want kind of Christianity to matter in the public landscape. So I try to talk about faith in a way that says, this is part of the social justice part is part of this tradition. Right? You don't have to reject your Christianity to embrace this. And we have some, a handful that come and talk to me in office hours, but they're pretty quiet in class because the majority opinion is one that's, I think, suspicious of Christianity.
Hi, I'm John. I'm going to label myself on the extreme right, still there. Some things that I do not understand. In grade school and in small children, the areas are being taught that they can be either male or female, they can change the gender. I don't believe in that. I believe God made us one way now. That's not to say that we can't try to change it. When they go into schools for the young school children and preach that to them, I highly disagree. Now, I don't believe everything on the right is correct, but I am leaning in that direction.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, there are good reasons that gender-affirming care, this idea that we kind of accept children's sort of gender identity as presented and affirm it, has come under, has been controversial. And what I would say is that, I have trans students in my classes who knew in adolescence that their gender identity did not match their biological sex. And what I would kind of encourage you to think about is there is, I think, a line between we need to affirm everything kids do. I don't think that's a good, I'm a parent of 2 small kids. I don't think that's a good idea to affirm everything kids do, but I do think it has been profoundly important for some of these students to have people say, I hear you, and I see you, and I know that's who you are, and maybe you have to sit with it and sit in that kind of liminal space where kids are figuring things out rather than just shutting it down. That's where I would fall out on that issue.
There are areas in the country that are taking young children, I mean very young children, and trying to change their gender even before letting the parents know that. Now, again, well, I think you're wrong there, but besides that, I don't care what people think, what I say, because I'm who I am and what I am, and I'm going to be there. And I can say I think a lot of this is wrong.
Yeah, I hear you. I think it's I suspect that instances of kind of active promotion of gender transition at a young age are very exaggerated. I am sure there are one-off cases, and I don't think we ought to overemphasize the one-offs and suggest. I mean, I have a first grader. I certainly don't see any of that happening in her education, even in a very liberal area of the country here. So I'm not terribly concerned. It doesn't sound like I'm as concerned as you are about that happening at a young age. Well, okay. One more.
It's normally ladies first, but I raised my hand.
I don't think you feel like
No. But, I really appreciate the walk through history because when you're talking to someone, generally you're just exploding on what's happening now.
Yeah.
And what I like to do is try to get them to come back to, well, gee, our founding fathers said this, and this is how they did it, and this is how. So that really helped me out to see the history, so that you can get a common ground to talk about what's happening right now. And perhaps you're all talking about the same thing. And so I really appreciate your talk. It was so enough to where us older guys could understand it, and it was to the point.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
I just wanted to respond to what you were saying because I served a congregation in the Castro in San Francisco, so it doesn't get more gender affirming than that. What you were describing was not happening in the schools there. I can tell you that because I know.
I don't believe that. That's fine.
Okay.
Okay. Like I say, I don't care what the group thinks or what I am. It doesn't matter to me. I had a conversation with that. I'm who I am and what I am and what I think. And I think a lot of that is wrong. I don't believe in it. I can't accept it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just have a question. You talked about strategy and triage.
Yeah.
So, decide the right time, right place to talk. And then the second one was acknowledge that changes are unsettling and grappling with the change. I think that was very good part.
I was rushing at that point, so let me try to recreate what I said. I think the last thing I was trying to communicate was that our Christian faith always has to kind of maintain a commitment to the justice, the welcome that Jesus showed. And we're going to differ, as we've just seen, we're going to differ on what justice looks like, but But I think we have to kind of return again and again to the model of Jesus as somebody who welcomed the stranger, somebody who welcomed people that did not fit the accepted classes. So that, I think, was maybe the third. All right, I do want to honor our time. I know some of you are ready to go. I'm happy to stick around, though, if anybody wants to come and chat one-on-one. Thank you so much for having me. It was lovely to be with your congregation.
Bye-bye, everybody.